Welcome to the Acid for Squares podcast. I'm your host, Cody Blue.
And I'm Tanya Dahl. And if you like what we're doing here, please make sure to like, subscribe, rate, comment, follow, all that sort of stuff. It helps us out a lot. And today's episode is a very special and different episode than we ever do. This is the Lost episode.
The Lost episode.
The first episode that Cody and I ever shot for Acid for Squares.
No one has seen it.
I mean, this was almost a year before we ever put out the first actual episode. So this truly is the Lost episode, and it was never going to reach the public, but we decided now is the time.
Yeah, the reason we're releasing it now is we feel like the conversation is too important to keep from the public eye anymore. And, you know, this is a very pertinent episode, and it's with one of our biggest guests to ever come on the show. So you're going to notice that the set is different, the lighting is different. Me and Tanya are a little, you know, our interview style is a little different, but what he says is groundbreaking and life-changing. And our guest is no other than the Danny Sheehan. And if you don't know Danny Sheehan, he is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, constitutional law attorneys and civil rights attorneys in the world. I mean, this dude has done Watergate, Iran-Contra, Karen Silkwood, the Pentagon Papers. This guy is a legend in the space, and recently he has taken on the UAP and UFO phenomenon and put it on his back. So, I mean, as far as we're concerned, and me and Tanya have, you know, had the honor of talking and hanging out with people like Dr. Greer and, you know, Lou Elizondo, and Danny is I think he's the person I trust the most out of anyone.
He's the one that all of them trust.
Right.
He is the go-to guy for sure.
Yeah, and Danny built something called the New Paradigm Institute, and it's at the forefront of disclosure and changing the laws to bring out all that's been hidden and kept in the dark around the UFO and UAP phenomenon.
And also creating a course for UFOlogy. It's literally the first accredited school. Is it university or is it a school?
Yeah, I know it's accredited at colleges. I'm not sure if it's a university itself, but
it actually gives you a degree in UFOlogy and also all of the history of UFOs and government cover-ups and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally everything. And he is who's been representing Lou Elizondo for the past several years, who is the Pentagon whistleblower, who has really mainstreamed this phenomenon. So if you're going to listen to anybody, you're going to want to listen to Danny Sheehan. And I should say how we know Danny and have a personal relationship with him is that we were working on a project, the Dr. John Mack project, a biopic about the most accredited academic to ever study, look into, and validate the UFO abduction phenomenon.
Yeah, Cody was writing a script about him.
Yeah, and that's how I met Danny, through the production company. But when John Mack came out with his book on his patients who claimed to be abducted, he was put on trial by Harvard. They tried to discredit him because essentially the subject matter was radioactive and they thought it made them look bad. And it's the only impeachment a tenured professor had ever faced at Harvard. And Danny at that time stepped in to represent Dr. John Mack. So this is how we know him. He's been at the forefront of this movement, and what he has to say on today's episode about UFOs, UAPs, and the spiritual nature of the phenomenon is truly groundbreaking, and I don't think I've ever heard him speak at this length about the subject matter.
No, this is actually a very different interview than a normal interview from Danny Sheehan. This is not just about UFOs and about the disclosure and the cover-ups and all that sort of stuff. This goes actually very deep, like Cody was saying, into the spiritual nature of these events. And so this is a very, very unique opportunity to see Danny Sheehan in a very different light, it was really cool for us to listen back to it. So we think that you also are going to get a total kick out of this.
Yeah, and I think the weirdest thing is when we recorded the episode so long ago, we thought it was too much too soon for the audience. Yes. We were like, are they ready for this? This is like advanced math, right? But now it's like, oh man, this show is so crazy.
It's ready.
Like, if you listen to the show, like, you're going to love this.
Yeah.
But all right. Yeah. So kick back, relax, and enjoy the ride. This is the Lost episode of Acid for Squares with Danny Sheehan. All right, welcome to the Acid for Squares podcast. Danny, thank you for staying with us so we can talk about the implications, the spiritual implications and the implications around consciousness that UFOs and UAPs, bring to light. And I would love to just start with you talking a little bit about the work you did with Dr. John Mack in the 90s and take that into sort of this conversation around what this means for consciousness.
Sure. What happened is back in 1994, I got a call from I was teaching. We were living at Jackson Brown's ranch out in Santa Barbara, and we were teaching at the University of California at Santa Barbara, the hidden history of America, the history of CIA covert operations from World War II to the present.
What a cool course!
And I got a call from Ron Robertson, who was teaching. He was the head of the art department in the City College in Santa Barbara. He called me, and he'd been a follower of us during the Iran-Contra case and Karen Silkwood case and stuff when we would come to California and do talks. And he asked if I would, Sarah and I would come to dinner, and we agreed to do that because we knew them. And so I went over to dinner with Ron and Helen. And we got to the dessert part, and he said, Danny, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? I said, no, it's fine. He said, well, what do you think about the UFO thing, in the whole thing about extraterrestrial intelligence? And I said, I think it's one of the most important possible things that people could even be talking about. And he said, really? He said, well, how come you never talk about it? And I said, well, you didn't ask me, And he said, well, look, my best friend is Dr. John Mack, who is the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And I said, oh, wow, that's interesting. I said, somebody just brought me his book, I said, last week. And I was looking at that. And he said, it's not public at all, but he's been brought up in front of this committee, the faculty committee at Harvard, for writing that book. And he needs help. And would you be willing to take a call from him? So I did. And John called me and flew me back to Cambridge, which I was always glad to go back to hang out in Harvard Square. And it turns out that what had happened is that the United States intelligence community and Defense Department have a covert operation that's underway to suppress anybody who tries to report UFOs, if they're in the military or inside the government at all. Threatens their career. One of the very first things they have to do if they report a UFO incident and they don't take the hint that they're supposed to not write anything up officially about it, then the first thing that happens is they're ordered to go get a psychiatric examination. It's true, which is not a career builder. And so a number of these people have been sent to go to the number one college in the world, the Harvard College, to have the Department of Clinical Psychiatry administer this battery of psychiatric exams. And John had done a handful of these. And he was puzzled, he said, because he had done all the tests on them, and all of these major officers had tested out of being very much within the parameters of normal psychiatric health. He said, and yet they were talking about this extraordinary thing that they had seen. And so he called his mother, actually, who was about 90 years old at that time, and told her about this. And she said, oh, well, you should talk to the young Hopkins boy, that their families were friends. The Mack family were friends with the Hopkins family, and it turned out to be Bud Hopkins. Bud Hopkins was this artist in New York that came from a very wealthy family, and he had taken up this avocation of interviewing people who thought they had had abduction experiences. And so Bud Hopkins was able to introduce to John a significant number of other very, very credible, regular people who were completely convinced that they'd had this direct, immediate contact experience with a UFO, in some cases the occupants. And so John did a number of these interviews, of these people, and was helping to provide counseling for them, because some of them were distressed over the fact that they had lost time. That they would see some kind of a strange craft land in a field nearby, and they would go outside, and the last thing they remember was going out and walking out onto their porch, and then they woke up the next morning like in their own bed with their clothes on.
Yeah, that would be.
And they couldn't figure out what was going on. Yeah. So it was kind of distressing for them. So John ended up, he started a process. He became intrigued by this. At first, he started out thinking it was some kind of a strange new psychiatric kind of condition that people were having, but he couldn't find any other indicia of any other kind of psychological instability on the part of the people. And so he started this investigation. When he would never hypnotize anybody. John Mack never hypnotized anybody. What he would do is he would get them, if they would agree to do it voluntarily, to do this thing called holotropic breathing. Stanislav Grof had developed this entire thing, and for going into kind of an altered state of centered consciousness.
Could you explain a little bit about holotropic breathing if somebody doesn't know what that means?
Yeah, the holotropic breathing is a variation of kind of Hindu breathing exercises. When people do yoga exercises, there are certain kinds of intense breathing exercises, that people can do, and you will go up into an altered state, kind of a high vibrational frequency state. And so Stan Grof had developed this technique of using it instead of hypnosis, so that people remember absolutely everything that they can think of. They remember things in very detailed way. So John had been trained in this. So John would have these people do the holotropic breathing exercises, and they get very, very relaxed, and they'd start to be able to remember the details of their occurrences.
Wow.
And so what he started doing is when they were in this kind of really calm state, he would ask them, like they say, classic example, young contractor, 32-year-old guy from New Hampshire. He came home one Friday night from work and was preparing a little TV dinner for himself. And he's in the kind of rural area up in New Hampshire. And he thinks he's heard somebody out on the porch. He looked around and there was nobody there, so he ignored it. And he thought he saw somebody go by the window. So he gets up and he looks out the window. And that was the last thing he remembered. And he woke up the next morning in his own bed with his clothes and shoes and everything on.
Oh, wow.
And so he was distressed by this, and after a number of weeks or something, he kept on having more and more anxiety about the fact he couldn't remember what had happened to him. And a friend of his said, there's a guy down at Harvard, at the Harvard Medical School, that has been doing some interviews of people about this. You might want to go down and talk to him. So he went down to talk with him, right? John talks to him. He comes and brings him to the house, and he started to do the holotropic breathing. And so the guy started remembering. And he said he got up and went out into the kitchen. And he looked out at the window, and he said, and there she was. And John said, who was it? Big, huge, round head, big, dark black eyes, kind of oval-shaped eyes. And he's describing a UFO person, like an ET being. Yeah. And then what happened? And he talks all about the fact she asked him to come outdoors. He walked out into the meadow, and he went into the craft and got a physical examination and did the whole 9 yards. And then they bring him back and put him in bed. And so John had him come back a week later to say, that was really an interesting thing. Let's try to go farther. So he comes back and he gets all relaxed and he's lying on the couch and he says, okay, let's get back to the spot where you go out to the kitchen. He says, I go out to the kitchen and I look, and there she is. And John said, I couldn't help but notice that it sounded like did you recognize her? Did you recognize? He says, yeah, I recognized her. He said, well, where had you seen her before? And then he started talking about how back when he was like 20 years old, he was coming home from college, and coming home for a weekend, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, driving in, and this big light kind of craft landed in a field, and he got up and walked out into the field to look at it, and there she was. Long story, but anyway, the bottom line, it was things like this were happening to John. And so John decided he was going to start asking people questions like, okay, you're inside the craft? Yes, I'm inside the craft. And he would have them look around and describe little tiny things like that no one would ever talk about. Like if they had an examination, what did the instruments look like?
Oh, that's so cool.
Described it in detail. And so he was actually investigating so that when he would do other interviews of other people, if they would describe things that were very similar with no reason why they would have any idea of ever
Yeah.
knowing the other person said. And so John had become convinced that something real was going on here. And so he wrote an article for the New England Journal of Medicine and submitted it to them. 2 weeks later, it was sent back to him in the envelope, and it said, no, we're not going to publish this. And he was perplexed by that. He said, I'm the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. I have I'm a winner of the Pulitzer Prize.
Right.
And so he said, I'm going to dress up the article and fill in more footnotes and do more academic stuff. And he sent it back. 2 days later, the executive secretary for Arnold Relman, who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, comes to his office and said, Dr. Relman has told me to return this to you and to notice that it's unopened. That he's not even going to open it. He's not going to look at it. He's not going to read it. And under no circumstances is he going to publish this. And so John got upset. And the bottom line is he called a publisher and got it published. And it was published in 1994. It was called, and the publishers, give it different names. They called it Abduction, Human Contact with Aliens. And it was a bit of a sensational title, but it was a bit of a sensational subject, as it turns out. And so that within a few days of the publication of this, Arnoldson, the dean, comes in and says, oh, John, I've heard that you've published another book. And he said, yeah. He said, well, look, it's really interesting. The number of the people in the faculty have been interested in this. Why don't we get together with some of the other faculty people and discuss this? John said, oh, that would be great. Let's do that. So he sets up a time to go meet with him. So John shows up for this meeting, and here's this tribunal that's been coordinated. It's like a 4 or 5 person tribunal.
He's am I in trouble?
And here they were, boy, and they just started to excoriate him, right? So he got totally upset about this and called his mother.
I love that he calls his mom all the time. I get it.
And said, and she said, well, you should probably just go see the family lawyer. So he goes over to the family law firm, because it was a fairly wealthy family. His father had been a doctor, the grandfather a doctor. So he goes over and the lawyer tells him, oh, just give them whatever they want. If they want to have the recordings of the sessions, did you bill them? Did you let them know ahead of time that it was a study? And he's freaking out, saying this doesn't seem reasonable. And then he discovered that the attorney worked for the same law firm, Ropes and Gray, that was the attorney for Harvard University. He called his best friend, Ron Robertson. I got trouble here. People are harassing me. And Ron Robertson said, have you thought about calling Danny Sheehan? And he said, oh, Danny did the Pentagon Papers case and all these kind of cases. I don't think he'd be interested in this. And Ron Robertson said, well, why don't I ask him? And he did. And so that's how I became John's lawyer, right? And we go through this whole process with the committee. I show up with him at the next meeting of the tribunal. They start interrogating him again, that Arnold Relman starts demanding him answering questions. I said, excuse me here. I said, I don't know exactly what the nature of this particular faculty committee is. It's certainly not an AAUP authorized hearing. The Association of American University Professors has a whole set of protocols for people who are tenured, and you can't just do this. And he said, oh, no. He said, this was just, that when the book came out, a number of people started calling the dean here of the medical school. And he said, and they were asking him kind of questions, and he didn't know how to answer the questions. And so he thought he would just get together with you. And as long as he was going to get together, we'd have some other people. Here he is like, it's like this, like it's an easy conversation where there's this tribunal there, right? And so I said, oh, really? I said, well, okay. Then in the spirit of cooperation, can you tell me who is it that called? There was this big dead silence fell over the room, right? And he looks over, and the lawyer for Harvard shakes her head like this. He said, oh, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that. And I said, okay, well, look at, if they're asking questions that he wasn't able to answer, can you tell us, in order to help you on these things, what were the questions that they asked? Big, long, dead silence, No, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that. So I said, well, look, just let me ask this question then. Is it likely that either one or both of the two following factual questions might be at issue in the course of these hearings, whatever the nature of them are? Like, number one, whether UFOs are real, and number two, whether they might actually be vehicles from an extraterrestrial civilization. And Arnold Relman said, well, absolutely they're going to be relevant, and it's completely ridiculous to think that either of those two things is true. That's what he says to me. Harvard University, right? Like 1994. And I'm going, what? You know?
Eating his words now.
And so I said, well,
Yeah.
I said, then I should probably tell you in all fairness that John and I just spent the weekend with Lawrence Rockefeller. And Lawrence Rockefeller has agreed to finance an entire grand rounds here at Harvard University on the issue. And I'll put together the witnesses for you. You know, we'll bring in the chief investigator of the Federal Aviation Agency. We'll bring in the commander of the Maelstrom military Minuteman site that had all their missiles turned off by the UFO. You know, well, the lawyer for Harvard jumped to her feet and she says, absolutely not. We're not going to have this procedure turned into some kind of a circus, she said. And so I said, okay, John, that's it. We're out of here. Let's go. And so I helped pick him up out of his chair and we left. And then I got to go around and meet everybody to prepare the witnesses to present for John Mack. So I got to meet Stanton Friedman. I got to meet Bud Hopkins. I got to meet David Jacobs. I got to meet all of the major people that are involved in the researchers and everything. I got to Linda Morton Howe, and very important, I got to start meeting lots of experiencers.
Right.
So that's how I got into it with John. And then John, it started dawning on him that he was so shocked at the attitude that was being displayed by Harvard University, who, you know, perceive themselves as sort of the seat of the liberal ethic in Western civilization, you know, justified or not. And so he realized that this was a complete clash of worldviews.
Yeah.
That there was some completely different worldview going on in it, that Harvard University didn't really believe any of the spiritual dimension. It was kind of read out of the university, except for the divinity school.
Yeah.
You know, and so
Logic.
They were into a scientific, logical, positivist, strictly materialist worldview, in that this was completely antithetical to the worldview. And so John realized that they were over into this other area, but he also knew that it wasn't really the traditional religious studies. This had to do with indigenous experiences, you know, the medicine experiences that the indigenous people have, who talked about, he realized all the time of meeting star people coming from the stars and things.
You hear it over and over and over again.
Over and over again. And so that he began this exploration of what the interface was between the UFO experience and what we normally refer to as spiritual or metaphysical type experiences of higher consciousness. And so we had agreed, he and I, that we were going to found the New Paradigm Institute there at Harvard University.
And this is you and Mack?
This is John Mack and I, okay? And that was back in 1994. And so that's how we got going on this. And so John and I began to have these conversations, and he didn't realize that I had been to the divinity school, that I had gone to the divinity school after I'd already graduated from Harvard College and then Harvard Law School. It was out practicing law, and it ended up going back at the request of John Rawls, or in discussions with John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy.
Can I ask why you went to divinity school?
Well, it was I had been out practicing law. I realized, you know, there's things are going on in the world that are completely different than we'd been taught. You know, like you're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah.
You know? And so I went to go meet with Dr. John Rawls, who was the head of the political philosophy department at Harvard University, to discuss with him a book he had just written called A Theory of Justice. And he ended up asking me to come back to Harvard University to do a master's and a PhD in comparative social ethics. And it turns out that the professor who taught comparative social ethics, Dr. Ralph Potter, was over at the Harvard Divinity School. So I ended up going over to the Harvard Divinity School and started to dig in on the whole spiritual dimension. You know, as an investigative attorney, we had all kinds of great sources now, and you know that I developed relations with investigative journalists, and I developed relations with professional investigators over in Lee Bailey's office. We had a whole office of 40 Class A licensed professional investigators.
Wow.
And so I had access to them, Moriarty and Associates, right? And so I was at the Divinity School and was doing my master's work to start with, and ended up getting contacted and recruited to become general counsel for the United States Jesuit Order in Washington, D.C., in their social ministry office, the public policy office. And so I got down there, and then so I had access to 10,000 Jesuits all around the world. who were gathering intelligence and information and stuff and sharing it with the Vatican. And so I was tapped into that. So we started to develop these resources for working on things, and I became fascinated about the fact that not only was there this whole other world going on, this covert world of kind of a deep state kind of functioning, but I also realized that there were all of these realities inside the churches of the capacities of our human family that were being kept secret from the laity. You know, that they had monks in monasteries who could levitate and that could engage in predicting the future. They had all kinds of capacities. And then I started reading lots of more and more stuff about Hinduism and Buddhism and realizing that it was, they were in their secret documents that had been held secret for centuries.
Wow.
About all these capacities that the human species has. And I was completely fascinated by this. And so I began working on this. And then I started realizing that the more information that I was finding out about the UFO phenomenon and the beings that were, or people, the UFO beings, they were displaying things that were like siddhas.
Yeah.
They were like Hindu siddhas that human beings are capable of. Therefore, the secrets were not only being kept about the existence of the UFOs and the extraterrestrial beings coming and going from the planet, but the churches and synagogues and other religions were keeping secret from the people the actual full capacities of our human species.
Right.
In that they were a lot more similar than people wanted to pretend. And so I started exploring, what the relationship might be between our human species and the extraterrestrial species, because they seemed to be similar. I mean, there they are. They've got two legs, two arms.
They're kind of humanoid looking.
They're kind of looking like kind of. And I said, I'm wondering what the connection is here between these folks.
Well, that's the funny thing is when I was doing research for the John Mack movie, I would meet with some detractors, and what they would say is the likelihood in all of infinity that the extraplanetary consciousness, the entities that are interacting with us would be humanoid and have two eyes and hands and feet. The likelihood of that is so infinitesimal that you should know it's fake. And when I would go and talk to the experiencers and the abductees, they would look me dead in the eyes and say, that should let you know exactly their relationship to us. And that's the thing. You're so uniquely qualified through all your experiences to grasp the multidimensional nature of what is called the abduction experience, or UAPs or UFOs. And the thing I love about you and John Mack's story is John Mack is the most acclaimed academic to ever support the abduction syndrome and the UFO phenomenon. Pulitzer Prize winner. He was just nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize right when this was going down. And he's the first professor, tenured professor, to be put on trial in a sort of academic witch burning. And we sort of learned that academia and conventional scientific, wisdoms can become a dogma if you let it become a dogma. And we he came up against that force, right? And he was a scientific martyr figure, and he pushed the movement forward to what it is today. Sadly, he's not with us to enjoy the fruits of all his efforts. Right. But at the same time, what I loved is when I first got kind of briefed into the Mack material, and I was literally given the tapes of his patients recordings, it scared me. But then after I met with his patients 20 years later, they were all shamans, mystics, healers, and they had a spiritual perspective on the phenomenon. Yeah. And, for me, the awakening around this specific phenomenon was an awakening around the spiritual nature of reality. Yes. And this, to me, is the smoking gun of the implications of where we've been, where we're growing, our capacities, our true nature, and just the true spiritual nature of reality. And I think I could not even fully grasp the UAP, UFO, alien abduction phenomenon without having a more spiritual perspective.
Absolutely.
And coming as an atheist or agnostic or scientific materialist, grown with religious trauma, coming into the material, like it really took a reorientation into an entirely different worldview, a paradigm shift of the way I view reality. And I'm wondering if you could speak about what are the implications on human consciousness or the greater collective consciousness for this sort of UAP, UFO abduction phenomenon?
Because it kind of seems like the UFOs and ETs, if they have these abilities that we should have, then keeping both of those hidden would make sense. Because if we come together and actually understand the extraterrestrials, then we will greater understand ourselves.
Well, the way that the reason that I was as interested in this is I have been ever since I was like 5 or 6 years old, and was old enough to actually be allowed to be out at dark when it was starting to get dark, and I would look up and see the stars coming. I was way up in northern New York, way up in the Adirondack Mountains, where I grew up, north of Lake George, and it's like 90 miles from the Canadian border. There's nothing but forests everywhere.
It's beautiful there.
And you would have the entire Milky Way galaxy kind of just sitting right on top of you. And so when I realized, I look up and I see all these billions and billions of stars, and then I learned that these were like our sun, that they were actually little suns, and that I was certain they must have planets going around them. And then I realized that there'd be people on these other planets. And I was only 5 or 6 years old, and I was saying I would try to have my mother allow me to go out and sit in the grass and watch the stars come out, and I would find one of them, and I would see and they would pulse like this, and I always had the sense that they were sending some kind of a vibrational message out from the stars, and that I would pick out a star and I would just say, okay, there's a planet probably going around that star, and there's probably somebody standing out in there for us, or just looking up at the star and seeing our star, and wondering if there's a person standing in the field looking up at them. I
love little Danny. And
then I realized that how completely kind of transcendent that whole experience was and is. And then when I began to discover the kind of strange things that people were doing, the kind of activities that we're engaging in here, and everybody fighting with each other and stuff, is so completely incongruous with realizing what the larger context is that we find ourselves in. And I realized that the more expansive your view was of taking into account the fullness of all the reality all around you, the less inclined you would be to get carried away about these weird things that people were arguing and fighting about.
Don't even matter.
And so I decided that I was going to become an astronomer, right? And so I started studying all about the stars and the planets and all this other kind of stuff. And then I realized you had to do lots of math. And it wasn't that I didn't know how to do it. I did calculus. I said, but this is not fun. Yeah. But it turns out that's what you end up doing most of your time on. And so I said, no, that by that time I said, I'll be an astronaut. Nice. That's what I'll do. I'll be an astronaut. And so I ended up becoming the #1 candidate for the Air Force Academy in New York State. Wow. In 1963, when I graduated from high school. I just said, I'll go down and I'll interview the United States Senator, Jacob Javits, and get the senatorial appointment, and go to the Air Force Academy. So I go to talk to Jacob Javits down in New York City, and he says, so Dan, he says, why do you want to go to the Air Force Academy? I said, because I want to, get to be an astronaut and get to go out in outer space. He says, well, everybody, all the young boys want to be an astronaut now in 1963, with John Glenn and all that. And he said, so why do you really want to be an astronaut? I said, this is one of the most remarkable periods in the entire history of our human family. We're right on the brink of stepping out into the stars and getting to meet all of these other civilizations and all these beings from these other planets. And he said to me, you actually believe that there's other beings on these other planets? And I said, well, sure. So do you. You're a United States Senator. I said to him, you must know that. And he was completely flabbergasted that I'd said that to him, at the age of 18. And he was kind of taken aback. He said, oh, gee, Dan. He said, I'm kind of embarrassed, he said, because I hadn't really expected this kind of a conversation to be taking place. He said, but I should be candid. He said, I've already given the appointment to the Air Force Academy. I'm not supposed to, but I did, to the son of one of my financial backers. Oh, wow. He said, but I'll give you the appointment to the Naval Academy. And I said, I'm not into boats. I said, I'm into airplanes. I want to fly airplanes. I want to get to go. And he said, oh, no, you can be a pilot in the Navy, too. I said, I'm not into the boats and flying around in aircraft carriers. I said, this is not working right. I said, the government, there seems to be a little out of tune here.
Yeah.
And so I said, I guess I'll be a lawyer and figure out how to help get things back in tune a little bit, and then I'll be able to get back to being able to be an astronaut and go to STAR. But when I got out practicing law, I realized that the government wasn't just a little bit out of tune, that they were playing a completely different song.
Right, right. Do you think that...
than we've been taught.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Do you think that essentially that reality is held together through our collective perceptions, that there is a war for essentially like the agreed upon perception of reality right now? Like, and are we just tapping into other realities when people are seeing these UFOs or UAPs?
That's a little too much acid. I think that's a little over top. I think it's a little more prosaic than that. And it's not that things that you realize when you're on LSD aren't true, because there's this whole range of depth of truth that one encounters. But in this particular instance, there is, and this is a profound question that you've asked, but that there is an actuality at a given point in time. Now, it may well be a function of the matrix of the perceptions of all sentient beings, but the fact is that there's an overarching consciousness.
Right.
That is the observer.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That causes the inchoate quantum fields to manifest in the next microsecond as either a particular wave of energy or a particle of mass that is consistent with an overarching consciousness, which is more than simply the sum of the total of all of the individuated consciousnesses of the sentient beings, and of course every other condensation of consciousness, which actually makes up the material realm. And so I began to explore all this when I was at the theology school and reading the readings I'd done. And I came to realize that beyond the parameters of the sum total of mass and energy that make up the universe, even the multi-dimensions of the universe, and therefore the multiverse that they talk about, that when you get out to see what the sum total of all the mass and energy is in the entire physical universe, that out beyond that there's an infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness that, in fact, enfolded into being the original discontinuity
Right.
In the infinite and eternal field of completely undifferentiated consciousness of being, and that it's not a noun. That's the key to this thing. It's completely heretical to nounify God.
Yeah.
It's an experience of consciousness.
We are that experience.
That's right. In as is everything. In that this infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness generates this initial discontinuity, a microscopic discontinuity that actually has poles of differentiation that are still bonded to each other in relationship, and it's a kind of a wave of energy of consciousness that keeps them in immediate relationship with each other.
Right.
And it draws them back to each other. And that when they are drawn back to each other, they condense into the original particle of mass. And so you have your original wavelength of energy and the original particle of mass, and then this goes through an act of mitosis that generates an exact duplicate of itself. And then they both flash out of material manifestation back into complete consciousness. And then they flash back into material manifestation, either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass. And it turns out that happens at a complete random sequence. They've been spending time and time trying to observe these inchoate quantum fields as they materialize into either a wave of energy or a particle of mass. And there was no systematic pattern that could be perceived. But it was what they discovered with Max Planck and Niels Bohr and the others between 1923 and 1926. They discovered that if you could isolate an inchoate quantum field like that in its non-materially manifest condition, and you directed human intention toward it, this is what you're talking about. If you direct human intention to it, it will in fact collapse the wave function,
right?
And it will collapse into a material manifestation of either a wave of energy or a particle of mass.
Double split,
and it will occur. It will occur to a statistically significant degree to be consistent with the intention.
Yeah.
And therefore, you start to recognize now, in the midst of an acid experience, you start to understand the direct relationship between directed human intention and the actual collapse of the wave function. And you discover that human beings are capable of doing that.
Right.
That it's this extraordinary thing that we're capable of doing. And therefore, it has an effect upon the next micromillisecond of material manifestation, because it's got a relationship to your intention. But once you realize that there's this infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness that just abides out beyond the physical limitations of our universe, there is a consciousness there that is observing everything that's happening. And what our observations are, if in fact they're not a function of a completely independent nodal of consciousness, which is completely independent from your astrological predilections, your genetic dispositions, your environmental stimulation. That these are not acts of free will. I mean, you're robotized. You're pursuing unreflectingly conditioned responses on the part of even your intentions. So that the magic of meditation and being able to ascend into a place of complete unconditioned consciousness, which you will recognize is the same exact consciousness that every single being has.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's the secret, the open secret. The mystics that's why they have the little statues of people sitting there, just sitting there, in a state of meditation. People go, I wonder what that's all about. So what I'm saying is that this particular secret of there being an experience of completely unconditioned consciousness that an individual human being is capable of experiencing is the sole point from which any act of free will can possibly be undertaken, and you will exercise that exercise of free will completely consistent with the will of the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness.
Oh my God.
That is the will of God.
Yes.
And that's where it's at.
Oh, Danny. Okay. I was worried that I brought too much acid into the equation, and when but now, fuck it, let's go. All right. So what you just said is essentially, I think, the entire point. It's the foundational understanding to build the entire frame of the phenomenon around.
That's
and
right.
For me, I could not even understand the UFO and UAP phenomenon with an abduction phenomenon without fear if I didn't understand this. And I didn't understand it until I worked with psychedelic medicines and had the experience and the knowingness of oneness.
Yep.
Right.
Once you understand that all is one is all points in space and time are connected. Separation is the illusion, and none of us are well until all of us are well.
And the whole point is to get back to the oneness.
Exactly.
Understanding that we are all coming from the same source.
Is to recognize that you're already there.
Right. And but people want to know what they're doing when you start to understand that we are a part of them. You set off a nuclear warhead, you split that, you affect the farthest star. What is that Planck who said? You affect the smallest grain of sand, you affect the farthest star.
Yeah.
Once you start to understand that we are connected, we may feel like we're all separate, and not think
delusion.
that it's a delusion.
It's a delusion.
You think
part
that
of the game.
person's depression or liver cancer is not related to, it's all connected on a level that we can't even fathom. So when you understand.
You can't fathom rationally.
Right. Well, people start to say,
Linearly.
why are they here? What do they want? Well, that's what they want. They want the highest good of the all. And, they are on a level of, but the problem is that you cannot violate another being's free will. The long-term ramifications of that are, something we are still living in the wake of, which takes this all the way back to antiquity, to the Sumerian text. And that's the thing is, do you think that this phenomenon that is, let's say, 80 years old, the modern phenomenon, is actually ancient since the beginning of time?
Before the beginning of time, of our time here as a planet, and we as a species here on this planet. And so that you have to track this back and one would mistakenly try to track it back to the point in, quote, time, which obviously is not inside time, but that when the infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness generated the original microscopic discontinuity. But the fact of the matter is that's going on all the time. It's out of time, that this is actually the creation process is in process all the time, because our physical universe is oscillating. It expands. Every single element, as we know, in the periodic table that we discovered, has an atomic half-life, and it disintegrates into its lower constituent parts, into the other lower constituent elements, and each of those elements disintegrates. So we know that all the elements in the universe right now are not only expanding out, the universe is expanding out in a way, not out and away from the central point of the initial Big Bang, but in fact the point when every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe was originally in direct physical contact with every other one, and that was the size of the head of the pin that you hear about so much, and that when the polarity reversed and every single one of those ultimately irreducible integers of matter repelled every other one. That was the nature of the Big Bang. That's right in the next microsecond, the same bonding attraction that everyone has for every other one that then set back in. But the momentum of the expansion carried on. And so, for example, we know that every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe is attracted to every other one. We know that. It's just that the degree of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. We all know that. Okay, we've discovered that. It's not something you think about every day, but the fact is, it's a reality, and so that bonding phenomenon that goes on in the universe is real. But the impetus that has been imposed upon the expansion of this from the initial Big Bang is continuing, so that not only is the material universe expanding, and all of the elements are disintegrating at the same time, and they will ultimately reach a point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the universe, whether it's a wave of energy or a particle of mass, will stand separate and apart from every other one, and then they will all blink out into an inchoate quantum field, so that it's just consciousness again. And so then the abiding question is, does that mean that it'll just stay nothing? Will the universe expand and disintegrate into nothingness? That's the cosmological assumption of the first paradigm, the first major paradigm. And there's a whole octave of human paradigms or worldviews, in that each of them has its own political manifestation, from authoritarian to reactionary to conservative to moderate to liberal to utopianist, progressive to utopianist. These are all operational worldviews that go on in our human family at the point of perspective that we have. But the bottom line is that we have to have an entirely new paradigm, that is rooted in, and it's more than just the theological paradigm of the seventh paradigm now, the utopianist theistic paradigm. That we have to have an entire new perspective on this, and that's why some of the churches are anxious about this, because they think this is like a whole new religion. Right. And that's what some of the people that I'm talking to in Washington, D.C., inside the Defense Department and other places, they're worried that the UFO movement is like a religion, which is interesting.
But it's not a power, because it's not for control. Because religion is based around control. It's like, we have the power, listen to us, and listen to what we say, here's what you have to do, instead of listen to yourself, go within. And that, I believe, is what the extraterrestrial movement that's happening right now, of us understanding that there's something beyond us, beyond religion. It's spiritual. We are spiritual, conscious beings. It is not religion. This is not a religion, because a religion is about other people telling you what it is. It's about within us.
Right. The problem with theology is that it separates us from spirit, God, source, consciousness, because it's saying religion is the corporatization of spirituality. Yeah. It's just saying
it's the institutionalization.
Thank
corporations
you.
are a different deal.
Right. And the entire point,
they're bad in themselves.
Right.
But institutions are a pragmatic, functional thing that our human family has engaged in doing. from the point of view of the community, trying to make kind of collective decisions. But the bottom line is that the institutions have the constant feature of ossifying. And then
What's ossifying mean?
They become concretized, and they become thingified, and that they then believe that they have figured out the ultimate answer to things, and then they try to enforce it on everybody else, and that's what the institution tends to do, whether it's a nation state or a religion or any other entity.
And if not, you're going to hell.
So the bottom line is that what I'm saying is I've written an article on this already, about the fact that the ultimate mode of communion that we have with the extraterrestrial beings is this commonality of that nodal point of absolutely unconditioned consciousness that abides at the core of every single one of our beings, right? And that's the modem of communion. And when you communicate telepathically with the being, if you are in a transcendent state of unistic consciousness, they can recognize that. But of course they can recognize how low your vibrational frequency is as well, and they're afraid you're going to throw something at them, which some people do. To say nothing about try to shoot them
or shoot guns at them.
That kind of thing. But the bottom line is that's why we have to have disclosure not only from the national security state people in the Defense Department, intelligence communities, but from the religious communities, that they've been hiding these secrets from the laity for all this time. What are the alternative theories as to what the best mechanism is by means of which to communicate to another being the substantive content of mystical experience? And that they range across the worldviews. The octave of worldviews each has its own opinion about what the most efficacious manner is by means of which you can communicate the substantive content of mystical experience to each other. But it's an issue. And it takes place in their mode of spiritual expression. Every single one of the worldviews has, in addition to its own political worldview, it's got its own philosophy, it's got its own spiritual manifestation. That's where the different world religions come from. Right. That they're rooted in a different chakra. That's what's going on here.
Well, it's so fascinating to me because the mystical experience, whether it is oftentimes it could be like a game of like spiritual Pictionary. It's almost telepathic. You're getting these visuals.
Some symbols or something.
See, a Buddhist will get the Buddha. A Christian will get Christ, and it's one of the phenomenons is it's the non-corporeal, it's the ineffable, it's the non-physical. So you're going they're going to use
archetypes and the things that you know.
Right. So it's so hard to differentiate, and it's even made us start to wonder, like, well, is it even alien? Or are they using a Western spirit using a Western cosmology to create like a physical archetype for the experience? Do you know what I'm saying?
That's the Jacques Vallée and also Jung. Carl Jung wrote a major piece on this, believing that the actual UFOs are a photoplasmic projection into actual material manifestation of the subconscious fear that we have of our own future. And that's Jung has written about that.
Whoa,
that's wild.
Yes,
What?
yes. Oh, yeah, no. I've spent a lot of time investigating this thing, just like I would investigate any other case, of figuring out what are the alternative theories that people have expounded, how sophisticated are they? Some are fairly primitive, some are extraordinarily sophisticated. But the Hindus write about this. They write about the encounters with extraterrestrial beings. And as the indigenous people do, they're all communicating in this lower level of consciousness to each other about this that are experienced to a greater or lesser degree in a higher state of consciousness. Yeah. That's what's going on. And to be fair to most of the religions, that's what they start out trying to do. They start out trying to communicate to others who don't have access to this kind of metaphysical experience or metanoia experience. They're trying to communicate to them at a lower level of frequency, and then that becomes ossified. That becomes kind of concretized as a part of an institutional set of teachings. And that's clearly what's happened in the Catholic Church, for example. So what they do is they find it easier. The easiest method by means of which to do this is to find an individual person who has in fact ascended to an extraordinarily high level of consciousness, and then they can point to them. They say, whoa, whoa, look.
Yeah.
You know, look, but instead of saying, look what everybody is capable of, look what our human family is capable of, what they do is say, look what that individual being is uniquely capable
Putting
of
him on a
being.
pedestal.
And what did he say or she say? And then we'll do whatever it is they say. And then they get into worshiping them, and they, you know, and instead of understanding that this is a message, you know, that as Jesus said, actually, in the particular Christian tradition, is it's not so important what I say, it's what I am.
Yeah.
Right.
It's what I am, in that you will do greater things than I, you know, if you understand this. And that's what Teilhard de Chardin was writing about, the Jesuit paleontologist, you know, suggesting that Christ was a mutation of of where our human family is teleologically unfolding toward evolutionarily.
Evolution is conscious. You were just talking about the observer effect
That's right.
and the double slit experiment.
That's
I mean, the neuter, doesn't become a frog and leave the pond. It wants food. It's its desire and its attention that mutates itself. And that's what's happening. And that's literally, if you start to observe the protocols of the quote unquote UAP phenomenon, they are getting us to intentionally focus our intention and our consciousness towards that so we can evolve towards it.
That's right.
You know, there is on a vibrational level, a disparity between the material world and that transdimensional higher consciousness that we are interfacing and perceiving as UAP, UFO phenomenon. Right. Like, we are being called to raise our consciousness to bridge that, to be a bridge for contact.
That's right.
Well, it's getting us out of the three-dimensional space and getting us into realizing that there's something beyond us. And it's really blending. Like, that's why science and spirituality, like science and spirit need to blend in order for us to fully understand what this reality is.
That's absolutely right.
And until we do that, we're stuck where we're at.
Yeah. This is an extraordinary opportunity that our human family has here. We have the United States Congress, actually discussing this. And you have to be fair to them. They've come through a culture where they've been tasked inside a military training to perceive everything, through the prism of the nation state. In Gov 182 at Harvard College, when I was an undergraduate there, I had Henry Kissinger for American foreign policy.
Oh, wow.
Wow. And Henry, Dr. Kissinger, calls us. I was in the last all-male class at Harvard University in 350 years, right? And so that we had all these guys sitting in the class, Gov 182, and he says, gentlemen, he says, if there is any man here who does not believe that our nation has the right to lie, cheat, and steal, and even kill to pursue the interests of our own nation state, you should not remain in this class. That's what he said.
Whoa!
And so I said, I'm staying. I'm staying here. I'm going to find out what all these guys from Exeter and Andover and all these prep schools and stuff, what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I have found it out. I've stayed there, and I've gotten the advantage of being inside this thing and being able to see the people and talk to the people. The Sufi saying, when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. Wow. Okay? And it's not to equate a good faith person who's in the military with a pickpocket, but it's more the other story that Hal Puthoff told. Hal is the guy who was the founder for the Office of Naval Intelligence and the CIA, the remote viewing program. They were discussing in the Clinton administration. About the Rockefeller Initiative, where they were talking to each other, trying to figure out whether the Clinton administration would publicly reveal, through John Podesta and the others, would reveal more information about the UFO phenomenon. And they were having a meeting, and Hal was there. And he was talking with the science advisor to President Clinton. And Hal was saying to him, what is with this resistance? Why are they pushing back so hard against, our revealing to people what we know about the UFO phenomenon? The science advisor said, here, let's step outside so we can talk, which tells you something.
Yeah.
He said, let's step outside. And they were out walking along, and the guy turns to Hal and he says, I should tell you a story so you can understand what the answer to your question. He says, there's a story about this older man who is coming home from somewhere later at night, and he's walking through a field to go to his home, and he looks down in the grass and he sees this light like in the grass, and he bends down and he sees that it's a frog, and the little light is on the top of the head of the frog. And he picks the frog up, and it turns out it's a crown, a little crown on the head of the frog. And the frog looks up at him and says, "I'm not a frog. I'm a beautiful princess. A wicked sorcerer has turned me into a frog. And all you have to do is just kiss me, and I will turn back into this beautiful princess. And we'll be married, and we'll have many children. We'll be able to rule together in a beautiful realm." He looked at it and he said, "At my age, I think I'll settle for having a talking frog." And so this is the answer that the science advisor to the president gave to Hal about why they're not doing it. You know, that they've perceived it in an extraordinarily narrow way through the prism of their own worldview. They've been raised in a military culture where they've absolutized the nation state. You know, they believe that the dictate that comes from the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document that says that their ultimate mission is to establish full spectrum dominance over the planet, to be able to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed by our major corporations here in our nation state. You know, it's the Henry Kissinger theme. You know, and so that they have a different perception of this whole thing, and so what we have to do is try to generate a community, right, of people, and the constituency to whom we're talking now, right, are the people who have had this extraordinary opportunity to have experienced through one means or another a unitive experience, a realization, an experiential realization that all is one, and that in fact there is a nodal of consciousness that resides at the core of their sense of self that is in fact not a separate self, that is in fact a unitive consciousness that all people share, all beings share. And that if a person has been privileged enough to have had this experience, then if one can remember it, can maintain that level of consciousness, or even a memory of the consciousness, and a recollection, a consistent recollection, which ought to be refreshed each day. That's what the whole point of this is that you should do this each day to remind yourself of the reality of this state of consciousness. Right. And if you do that, it becomes more habituated, and you become more observant from a completely neutral perspective, that you transcend your astrological predilections, your genetic dispositions, your cultural training, and you function from that place. And most people recognize it, because what happens is that it causes an increased frequency, vibrational frequency of the photoplasma around your body, and it actually sets up a field around you that people can experience and can sense. And it actually kind of starts to draw people into kind of a sympathetic resonance with that particular vibrational frequency of your being. And that's why some of these avatars, the beings that we have around, can do that. And we all ought to aspire to that. And we're all flawed. We all get distracted and carried away doing the other kind of things that we're doing during the day. Yeah. But this is the avenue. This is the pathway. If people want to know how to maximize their usefulness in trying to transcend the secrets around from the churches and the Defense Department and everybody else, is you need to practice this kind of consciousness, and you need to organize from it and say that, look, that what we need to do is educate ourselves about each of these particular subject matters, be completely open and sympathetic to the people that have a different perspective on it, because that's the vibrational frequency that they're functioning at. Mm-hmm. And it has a lot to do, as you know, with the kind of vibrational frequencies of the different chakras. And if they're locked in one particular chakra, that's how they perceive things. The vibrational frequency of that particular chakra, that photoplasma that surrounds their body, is they prism their entire experience of reality through that particular field.
Right. And I want to say something really fascinating. I mean, I know we're at the end of our time, but you use the term chakra, right? It's an ancient term. It means energy wheel, right? And it's interesting. Some people have some spiritual religious aversion, but we know scientifically we all have EMF fields, electromagnetic fields. And when you look at it from an EMF field from a 3-dimensional perspective, not the 2-dimensional drawing of the chakra, you're looking at essentially toroidal spiraling loops that are in the center of the EMF field, just like the center of an apple of every living organism.
That's right.
And it seems that the rungs around the center, the spine of this EMF field, that different areas, different density, emotional densities cause blockages to this living organism. And that very much is the way the entire Earth's EMF field, the entire EMF field of reality, and we're working through greed, fear, sadness, doubt, all these different things to get to this, higher evolution of the collective.
I mean, that's part of the awakening process is we are born into this world with specific parents, with specific schooling, with specific friends in a specific area, a specific part of the world that creates this story around us that's really, really difficult for us to break out of. And we're living on autopilot most of the time.
That's right.
Until a certain point when we do become conscious, become awakened, and then we start to realize that there's more to it. Who are my thoughts? I become the observer now, and I can change the patterns that I have in my life. That's right. I can look into everything else as a sign or a symbol or something that's leading me to something greater the more that I look into it, just like extraterrestrials, just like ancient text. All of this stuff is leading us back to ourselves, which is just source consciousness experiencing itself in many different beings.
Right.
And the great news, dare I say, the good news is that it's all around.
Yeah.
That there are messages being left all around. Yeah. There are deep ancient spiritual traditions that our human family has been going through this evolutionary process where these additional faculties are evolving teleologically. That as Christ said, that we will all be here someday, and what he was trying to do is to help facilitate and accelerate that particular process. And that's ideally what the calling is. That's the ministry. That's the social ministry of trying to work with the people and help people ascend, not in any kind of arrogant way, like that, we're any more superior than they. We've been fortunate. I never would have done LSD, except that I was sitting taking my final exam at Harvard Law School, and we got take-home exams. And so I was up in Magic Mountain taking this final exam. And I'm typing away on this electric, and my dear friend came over to me and said, Danny, would you like some tea? And I said, no, I don't do tea. It's got caffeine and stuff. And she said, oh, this is herbal tea. And I said, okay, I'll do an herbal tea. So I was sitting there typing away. It was a criminal law exam, my final exam in criminal law.
Oh
so I'm typing away, and suddenly the exam started getting simpler and simpler. I was able to really kind of discern what to do. But and then Esther came back over to me and she said, Danny, would you like another cup of tea? And I said, well, that was really quite a pleasant little cup of tea. And so she brings me a second cup of tea, and so I finished the exam, and I push away the little electric typewriter, and I'm sitting there realizing I've finished Harvard College, I've finished Harvard Law School. I've been offered a position in the number one corporate law firm on Wall Street in the whole world. I've got the summer off. And so I'd come to this kind of nodal point in the educational career. So I was just sitting there, and I just turned aside, and I noticed this sunbeam shining through the window. We were in this wonderful, huge house up in Magic Mountain, Vermont. And it's May 30th of 1970. The sun is shining through. And I noticed the little dust motes kind of floating in the sunbeam, like that, and I fell instantly out of time like that, back to when I was 4 years old, and I was sitting on the floor of our house in Gansevoort, New York, and I was noticing this sunbeam and these little dust motes floating through, and I realized how much they looked like stars. How they looked like stars. And it just struck me when I was 4 years old that I had just realized what stars were and how much they looked like it. So I had fallen out of time instantly back to that point. And then within seconds, I came back. That was remarkable enough. What was most remarkable was the fact that I realized that the observer of both of those experiences at those two different times, one when I was 4 years old, another one when I'm now 24 years old, was exactly the same. That no matter how much education you got, no matter how much other things you got, it was still the same. And I was struck by that. And then I heard this laughing going on. And I turned around, and there's Esther and Joe Durham, my dear friend, and their friend Martha. And they were laughing. And I said, what's happening? And Esther said, Sheehan, you are such a wonk. Yeah, you're such a wonk. We just gave you two of the biggest hits of acid that we've ever seen. And you sat there and finished your law school exam. And so I said, oh, really? I said, okay, what are we supposed to do? Do we eat food? Do we eat dessert? What do we do? No, we take off all of our clothes and we go outdoors because we were way out in the backwoods somewhere where nobody else was around. And so we took off all of our clothes and we rush outside, and there was this deep, shoulder length grass out there, in May, and we're running through the grass and I go out through the grass and I lay down on this big boulder. And I'm lying on the boulder like this, and I'm watching the clouds go over. And I suddenly realized that it's not so much the clouds going over, it's the earth rolling under the clouds. And I look over, and a little muskrat comes up onto the side of the boulder like that, and he looks up over the edge of the boulder like that, and I turned to look at him. And at first, he was a little shocked, and then he realized, no, it's okay. This guy's in some kind of a...
This guy's tripping out.
This guy's in some kind of a vibrational frequency, so he ain't no threat to me. And the little muskrat came up onto the boulder and lay down right next to me like that, looking up at the sky. Oh. And we just lay there like that.
That's so cute.
That's a true story. And Joe Durham is over climbing a tree, completely buck naked, and he's up in the top of the tree going, I am God, like that. All of a sudden we hear this big joyous scream go up, and we look over there, and there's Martha up on top of this big hill with these two big lilies behind her ears, and she's just screaming with joy. And as soon as she lets out this big scream, this gigantic thunderclap goes bam, and the rain starts pouring down on us. I was just lying there, and I would say, this is amazing. That I never would have had this experience in 1,000 years. I wouldn't have done it because I was such a wonk. I was a big jock, and played baseball and football in college and stuff. And so that they visited this gift upon me. And once you know, you know
forever.
Look, that's the perfect way to end. And this is, so we're past our time. And what I want you to do is just put a little bow on this for us, because essentially, the fascinating thing is you're talking about John Mack and your work with him and holotropic breath. And when it comes to the nature of consciousness and quote unquote spiritual practices, it seems like they're becoming more and more into the mainstream, into the status quo, from breath work to meditation. And it seems like right now the mainstream public is sort of waiting for the government to continue to disclose this information, but really contact and the next evolutionary mutation of humankind is going to be led by people, and it's going to be through what are perceived as spiritual practices, which they are the practices of directing your evolutionary potential, hacking your consciousness, hacking your perception, understanding perception is reality. It's not what's true. It's what you believe, and leaning into this. And that's how contact is going to be made and how we're going to bridge into this new paradigm. Is there anything you would like to say in terms of just how people can access, tap into, and evolve their quote-unquote spiritual potential?
Yes. That one of the other things we're going to be doing at the New Paradigm Institute is training sessions for people to do meditation transcendental meditation, nothing, any particular doctrine or anything, but just to learn how to do meditation themselves, to think in terms of diet, of not eating super stimulating foods and using up all your energy trying to digest your food, that there are practices that are available throughout the spiritual traditions in the world, in that we can share these things and people can do the meditations. And very importantly, people can do the CE5 stuff. People can gather together, or you go alone or in pairs and sit out in a field and just look up at the stars and open yourself to the extraterrestrial beings, in addition to the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness, and open oneself up and invite the people and say, look at this we're here, we're welcoming, we're open to you, and that we undertake the disclosure process. The people ourselves have to lead the disclosure process, and the elected representatives will follow. And then they'll put the pressure on the people who've got some of the deep secrets and order them to reveal them, and they'll be more inclined to reveal them to everyone else. That we all have to participate in this in a positive, upward, positive, forward manner. Not in an antagonistic manner, not in a threatening manner, not in a blaming manner, but all of the human family, the time has arrived that we need to prepare. And so we need to get people prepared to be open to this experience, which includes the coming of the visitors. Not that they're here as saviors, but that they have differing levels of evolution that they're in, and that many of them know the secret. That we know the secret. Our human family knows the secret. It's just that there's a difficult time getting it shared widely enough.
Amnesia too.
So that's we need to do both things, and we're going to be doing that at the New Paradigm Institute. There are going to be entire courses, again, to share with people how to maximize this experience and how to translate that into reaching out into the stars to have these contacts with the extraterrestrial beings ourselves, to all become diplomats. We're human diplomats from our species to the extraterrestrial species today.
Amazing.
Beautiful. Thank you, Danny. Thank you so much.
much.
It all comes back to the Paradigm Institute. Everyone, please check it out.
ParadigmInstitute.org.
Yes, thank you. All right, Danny. Thank you for
your work,
everything.
Danny.
Until next time, brother, we appreciate you.
Till next time.
And that concludes the Lost episode with Danny Sheehan. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And you can tell humble beginnings for us in this show. And we appreciate you coming along for the ride. We hope you thought it was cool seeing, hopping in a time machine and seeing our very first interview in this studio and on this show. So thank you for everything. If you want to support the show, please go check out our merch. Where do they go, Tanya?
fourthwall.com/acid for squares, but you can also find it on our Instagram, our website, all that stuff. There are many different links that get you, or in our link tree, that get you right to the website where you can buy the merch firsthand. And
this is a way you can support the show if you want. All the proceeds go back into the production.
Yes, and also make sure to go check out our Patreon, which right now is free if you're listening when we release this episode. But right now our Patreon is free to sign up. There's a chat on there so you can create community. And there's going to be a bunch of other stuff coming very, very soon, including more lost episodes, which we're not going to air anywhere else except for Patreon. So thank you so much for being with us. We love you all and have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.